Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
The American presidential race has changed dramatically over the past 10 days. Or at least it feels like it has. If you follow American politics closely, or even if you just happen to spend a bunch of time online, you'll come away with the sense that a race that had been Donald Trump's to lose now might be a solid win for Kamala Harris. But vibes don't vote. And neither, for all their numbers, do polls. And there are still more than 3 months until a single ballot is counted. So yeah, it might feel like the race has flipped, but it technically hasn't yet. One thing, though, definitely has. It only took 8 years. Here is Michelle Obama, then the First Lady, speaking at the 2016 Democratic National Convention that nominated Hillary Clinton for president.
When someone is cruel or acts like a bully, you don't stoop to their level. No, our motto is, when they go low, we go high.
We all know how that turned out. But here, from this week, are prominent Democrats and Vice President Kamala Harris herself.
Well, it's true. These guys are just weird. And it is, they're running for He-Man Women Haters Club.
It's not just a weird style that he brings. It's that this leads to weird policies.
And by the way, don't you find some of their stuff to just be plain weird?
What is surprising here is not really that the Democrats finally decided to fight fire with fire. It's that it seems, so far, to be really working. So what exactly is the weird attack? Why does it seem to be making such an impact? How are the Republicans coping with their new opponent and the vibe shift? And what do we actually know, rather than suspect, about the state of the race right now? I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Aaron Rupar is a journalist who focuses on American politics. He writes the Public Notice newsletter, which is an invaluable resource if you're trying to keep up with everything that's happening right now. Aaron, how's it going?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me back on again.
I saw on Twitter that you were covering Kamala Harris's rally in Georgia last night, and you wrote about how unbelievable it is, how good the vibes are, how much they flipped. Can you describe that for Canadians watching from afar? What are those vibes right now?
Yeah, for lack of a better way of putting it, I would almost describe it as similar to like the Obama 2008 vibes, where, she got a rock star type of reception, extended cheering when she took the stage, pop stars on stage before her, introducing her. And so the shift from what we saw with Biden, where, he was kind of, for one reason or another, doing these low energy events and, reading from a teleprompter, and it just felt kind of stale. And, it set up the race as kind of two old guys running against each other. And now to have this infusion of someone with a little more vitality, who's able to put on a little bit more of a show. I mean, I think people were just really hungry for an option in this race that brought some excitement to the table. And the shift from 2 weeks ago to what we saw last night in Atlanta was really, really jarring. And I think, we're starting to see some of that in the polling as well.
That was going to be my next question, which is, vibes don't vote. But we've now had, I guess, 10, 11 days of polling since Biden announced that he would not be running. What have we actually learned about the numbers?
So what we've seen as more polling has come in, and now I feel like we've seen enough come in to draw some early conclusions, is that the deficit that Biden was looking at in some of the key swing states, such as Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, is pretty much already gone. And the polling has shown that, especially in Pennsylvania and Michigan, it looks like Kamala Harris has already pulled ahead. It's a little tighter in Wisconsin, but there's been some polling nationally that has shown Harris up by a point or 2 points. And so that's still within the margin of error. And so it's not like we're looking at a situation where suddenly, Harris is going to run away with this thing and we don't have to sweat it over the next 97 days, I think it is, between now and Election Day. But, we went from a situation where nationally Biden was trailing by 4 or 5 points to Harris being up 1 or 2 or tied. And, of course, the Electoral College is all based on the state-by-state results. And so it's going to be absolutely key for Democrats to win Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, states like that. And it looks like Harris is now very well positioned to do that. And she's even kind of pulled into a basic tie or a virtual tie in places like Georgia, which were kind of off the map for Democrats after Biden won the state in 2020. So, again, it's a little early. I think people are still kind of, people who aren't paying super close attention to politics are still getting to know her. She wasn't someone that, had a huge national profile. Obviously, when you're the vice president, people know who you are, but you don't really know who she is in terms of her policies and kind of what she brings to the table. But it seems like so far, as more and more people get to know her, they like her. Her favorability numbers are quite good, with more people, favoring her than unfavoring her or not favoring her, which is kind of a flip of what we've seen from the Biden-Trump dynamic in recent years. And so the early indications are quite good, but there's still some work to do.
I want to talk to you about how the Democrats are positioning themselves and what their strategy seems to be going into these final 90-some days. But first, how has Trump and the Republican world responded to the change in candidates? Like, what have they done in terms of their messaging, in terms of their approach, what they're talking about to confront a whole new race?
So they've really been flailing, and this has been surprising to me because obviously there was a lot of talk in June into July about the possibility that Biden would step aside. And the most obvious person, if that happened, was Kamala Harris, given that she's vice president. But it didn't really seem like when it actually happened that the Trump campaign had a strategy to attack her. And, we've seen that, even this morning I was watching Fox News and they're kind of attacking her. One Fox Business host described her as Obama in a skirt. We've seen kind of a lot of that kind of coded gender-based or racial criticisms of her, kind of dog whistling that does not seem to be resonating with the public at all at this point. And so now I think you're seeing them kind of pivot into the message that I think you'll see a lot of between now and Election Day, which is that she's a San Francisco liberal. She's kind of a radical leftist. She did have a voting record in the Senate that was quite progressive. And she does have some vulnerabilities. I mean, she took a lot of policy positions during the 2019-2020 Democratic primary that are pretty far out there on the left. She embraced banning fracking for one, defunding the police. She raised money for some of the rioters who were arrested in Minneapolis during the George Floyd protests and things like that. So, there are some real vulnerabilities, but it felt like it took the Trump campaign about a week to kind of figure out what those were. And in the meantime, Harris kind of had all this runway to really try to define Trump, try to define Republicans as weird, which has been the big talking point we've seen over the last week or so here in the United States. And so, again, I think that there are going to be some real issues that the Trump campaign Republicans will attack her on. But I think because it took them so long to get their act together, they've really been kind of wrong-footed.
I'm glad you mentioned weird. This is one thing I really wanted to talk to you about. And you didn't hear the intro, but I played a clip from Michelle Obama's famous clip from the 2016 convention, when they go low, we go high. And then followed by a little compilation of various Democrats and Harris herself, calling Republicans weird and a little creepy and that kind of stuff this week. Tell me about this new line of attack. And in particular, where did weird actually come from?
So this has been in the ether for a while in terms of how Democrats have talked about Trump and Trump Republicans. But in its current form, it really gained popularity from Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, who is on the short list for vice presidential candidates, who has taken during his TV interviews that he's done like on MSNBC or even on Fox to talking about Republicans as being weird. And I think the power of this is that I think some of the terms that get thrown around when people like myself talk about Trump Republicans, such as fascist or authoritarian, kind of fall flat with this certain segment of the voting base where they sound kind of jargony or people don't really know what they mean. But I think people obviously do have kind of an idea of what weird is. And I think when you think about these Trump Republicans, they're buying golden Trump shoes, they're buying $2 bills with Trump's image on them. There's kind of this cultish aspect to Trumpism, and then also the aspect of being kind of creepy towards women, wanting to control their bodies, kind of curtailing their freedoms. There's a lot of material there, obviously, to work with. And it's really kind of resonated, I think, as a way, kind of a shorthand to talk about Trump and his party that, makes sense for people who aren't super politically plugged in, who haven't, taken a class on 20th century authoritarianism or something like that. And so I've been really kind of surprised at how much this has taken off. But, like I said, Tim Walsh started talking about this during his TV hits. Kamala Harris has talked about it. Hillary Clinton has talked about it. And it seems to really be kind of the most powerful attack on Trump in terms of, having resonance and really being kind of like a viral talking point that I've seen in quite some time.
How can you tell if something like this is actually working in the real world versus, it's getting some great retweets online from people who are way too into this stuff?
That's a really tricky question. And I do sometimes wonder about the Twitter not being real life or social media not being real life aspect. I will say that, Kamala Harris has had way more traction on TikTok than Biden ever did, which kind of makes sense because she's younger. She's got a little more of like a telegenic personality. She appeals to celebrity culture a little bit more than Biden did or does. And so it can be hard to disentangle, like to the extent, TikTok and things you see there on Twitter carry over to real life. We already talked about the polling, which I think is one other way to think about this. But then, also I watch a lot of right-wing media, and you can tell that they're taking this pretty hard and, trying to kind of turn the weird thing around on Democrats. But it just doesn't really have the same salience because Democrats aren't out there talking about trying to restrict women's reproductive rights and things like that. I mean, these are things that Republicans are doing. And so when you try to kind of flip the script and talk about Democrats being weird because they support transgender people, for instance. Well, I think the fact that Republicans are fixated on transgender people in the first place is kind of weird, right? So it seems like it's kind of hit home with them, where they seem very concerned to kind of push back on it, and they don't really have a great response. And then, like we talked about earlier, I think you're seeing in the polling that, Harris is really gaining traction in a way that Biden wasn't. And so to me, that's the best indicator that whatever she's doing something right.
How does Trump's vice presidential pick, JD Vance, represent this strategy that Democrats are using? I mean, for those people who, as I mentioned, are not terminally online, can you explain like the past week that JD Vance has been having?
Yes. And so, I was actually thinking about this the other night, that I don't know if it was intentional or not, the timing of when Biden decided to step aside and announce that he wasn't running again, but it worked out absolutely perfectly for him to make that announcement after Trump had picked JD Vance as his running mate, because, JD Vance, one of his big things is that, he is extreme on the anti-abortion politics in terms of, he's talked about criminalizing crossing state lines, women who want to go from a red state to a blue state for reproductive health care. He's pretty much as far out there on a limb as you can get with some of this stuff. And so obviously there's a very different salience running against Joe Biden with JD Vance on the ticket versus running against Kamala Harris with JD Vance on the ticket. And, beyond that, Vance is kind of an untested person in national politics. He's won one election in Ohio for U.S. Senate, but Ohio is a very red state. He had a very well-funded candidacy with people like Peter Thiel backing him. So he had a lot of financial resources that other candidates didn't have. But even then, he won by about 10 points in a very red state. His polling was, his performance was pretty comparable to what Trump did in the state in 2020. And so now that he is on the national stage and out there doing rallies, it's become clear very quickly that he doesn't really have charisma. He tries to crack these jokes during his speeches that are very awkward, almost to the point of having to encourage people to clap for him. And his whole presence is just kind of alienating. And, there's already been some rumblings, and these are, still on the level of kind of rumor mongering at this point, that if Trump's polling continues to look pretty bad, that he might try to replace Vance as a way to shake up his campaign. Now, I think that's still more unlikely than it is likely that something like that happens. But, so far, even among Republicans, the Vance selection has been pretty widely panned. And I think if Trump could do it over again, knowing that he's running against Kamala Harris and not Joe Biden, he might try to pick a woman, someone with a little bit of a softer image, who could kind of help him in some of his weak spots instead of exacerbating some of the reasons that people are turned off by him in the first place.
Now I'm just curious, could Trump actually drop him from the ticket at this point? Like, he was nominated at a convention, right? Or was that just Trump who was nominated?
So there was some reporting that I read from the Bulwark, which is a conservative publication. It's never Trumpers. So people who are not fans of Trump, but are Republicans prior to that, who reported yesterday that, within Trump world, there has been, some lawyers working on what that would look like if Vance was replaced. It sounds like there would be a process to do that, but it might involve, some sort of like a virtual gathering of the RNC to ratify whoever the next person would be. Now, again, I still think this is pretty unlikely because I think Trump would lose a lot of face. But, if this polling continues to look pretty bad and Vance is out there kind of embarrassing the ticket, really being like more of a punchline than someone who's actually helping him. The idea Trump had was that Vance was going to basically park himself in the upper Midwest, in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and help Trump win those states. But, again, Trump's polling is pretty much since the RNC flipped, where now he's losing in those states when he, not so long ago had a pretty considerable lead. And it just doesn't seem like Vance is really breaking through in any sort of a meaningful way. Now, the other part of this is that, as I mentioned earlier, Vance has some very wealthy backers like Peter Thiel, Elon Musk. Musk pledged at one point $45 million a month to a super PAC aligned with Trump, but he's already kind of backed away from that. He did a quick interview, with someone who asked him about if he's going to continue donating that sum of money every month. And he basically said, I never really said I was going to do that. So, if that financial aspect isn't there, then I guess the question is, what is Vance really bringing to the ticket? And I think, the first couple of weeks have indicated not very much.
We've been talking about weird as, a personality thing and a line of attack. But one of the things I've seen some Democrats make clear is that this is also about policy that's weird. And then they immediately pivot to talking about Project 2025. For those, again, catching up on the state of the race over the past couple of weeks, can you explain quickly what it is and the impact that discussing it has had on the race?
Sure. So Project 2025 is a document that was put together by the Heritage Foundation, which is a right-wing think tank. And it has many, many authors, but almost all of them worked in the first Trump administration and would, in theory, presumably work for the second Trump administration. And it's basically a policy document outlining what Trump and Republicans would like to accomplish in a second Trump term, for instance, on reproductive rights. It talks about how, there might not even be a need to pass a national abortion ban if you make it so that abortion medications are illegal to ship across the country, basically make them unavailable, and you can ban abortion through other means and not have to go through the political wrangling and the political difficulty of trying to pass a national abortion ban. It talks about mass deportations and just, it kind of provides a roadmap for how Trump, with help from Republicans, can get from point A to point B with a lot of their policy priorities, many of which are very unpopular, very draconian, kind of brutal. And so for obvious reasons, Trump has tried to distance himself from this as it's become more and more of a talking point. And, really the origins of this becoming a big deal in American politics go back to after the first debate, or I guess the only debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump this cycle, when Biden's poor performance was making headlines, the Biden campaign tried to kind of shift some attention from that by really hammering Project 2025, trying to get people to talk about it. And it really actually was a quite successful push in that regard, where it became something that in Google Trends really picked up a lot of steam. And, it became something that people who aren't super politically plugged in began to discuss. And, the reality is that it really is the Republican agenda. Now, they've tried to kind of water this down, where at the RNC, the official Republican platform, is about 20 bullet points that were written out literally in all caps and don't have any details whatsoever. And so, they want to kind of mask that this is what they're ultimately up to. And, I don't doubt that if Trump is elected, there's a possibility that Democrats could still control the House and put the brakes on a lot of this stuff. But I think it's a very important document in signaling what Republicans' intentions are. And so if you're someone who supports reproductive rights or supports humane immigration policies, it definitely sounds an alarm and, it is a motivating factor trying to motivate people to go vote in November.
The last thing I want to ask you about weird is in the big picture. You mentioned that one of the reasons it works is because it's not, one of those scary, threatening technical terms like authoritarian or fascist or a threat to democracy. One of the things that I've seen discussed, and you kind of touched on it when you mentioned how Republicans in general were reacting to this, is that weird and creepy, it's mockery, and humor and derision seem to be something that authoritarian hopefuls are ill-equipped, to say the least, to deal with.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, there is a lot of absurdity to the Trump movement. And so, I think there's a wealth of material to work with in that area. And I do think, Trump does have one of his qualities that I think works in his favor sometimes is that he does have an ability to laugh at himself a little bit, but that's usually in the realm of like making fun of his hair, making fun of the way he's dressed, things like that. He seems to be a little touchier about making fun of him as kind of like a politician that people need to take seriously, or this kind of scary authoritarian. He doesn't like to be kind of mocked in a way that sort of undermines his power. And so, yeah, I do think that that's part of what's going on here is, kind of turning the tables, and instead of being scared of these people, to kind of laugh at them. And again, I think the fact that Republicans have been kind of flailing and don't seem to have a great response, other than to kind of try to turn the tables on Democrats, but in so doing, they talk about the very things that kind of make them weird in the first place, being fixated on people's gender identities or their private lives. I think that speaks to the power of it, and how, at least so far, Republicans really haven't been able to come up with a compelling rebuttal.
Aaron, this has been great, and thank you so much for walking us through this kind of, I guess, weird moment we're experiencing in the race. The last thing I want to ask you, and far be it from me to ask you to actually predict anything in this race, but I guess what comes next? It's Harris's vice presidential pick, and then the convention. Do we have a timeline for the pick? What are we looking at in terms of the favorites?
Yes, next week is going to be a crazy week. I'm already regretting that I'm going on a brief vacation next week, so I will not be around. But there is a rally on Tuesday in Pennsylvania that Harris is having, and reporting yesterday indicated that she intends to have her running mate with her at that rally. And so, as of next Tuesday, she'll be on the road with her running mate. The final contenders seem to be Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, we talked about briefly earlier, Mark Kelly, a senator from Arizona, who is doing the TV rounds, making the case for Harris, Josh Shapiro, Pennsylvania governor, and possibly another person or two that I'm forgetting. But, it seems like it's still kind of an open question as we talk today, a few days out from the announcement. They've played it pretty close to the vest, but the announcement will probably happen, it sounds like, next Monday or Tuesday. And then the DNC comes up a few weeks later, and it's going to be a very interesting DNC because the first night is going to be kind of an homage to President Biden. He's going to be the headlining speaker. And then I'm sure we'll hear from Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, kind of all the luminaries leading up to Kamala Harris speaking on the final day. And then I'll be very interested to see what the polling looks like after that, because traditionally parties get a little bit of a boost coming out of their convention. That was certainly the case this year for Trump. But if there is that sort of a boost for Harris, which I anticipate there will be, that could really be the first time in this cycle where it seems like Democrats are solidly ahead and on track to win this November. And so, it's still a very dynamic situation, but August is looking to be a pretty promising month for Democrats. And the DNC, I think, takes place, the last week of the month. And then you kind of hit the ground running into the final 2 months of the campaign, which really begins in earnest with the Labor Day holiday here in the U.S.
Aaron, thank you so much for this. Thanks for all the work you do at Public Notice. And as you put it on Twitter, watching Trump rallies so we don't have to.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Aaron Rupar, as I mentioned, of Public Notice, an incredibly worthwhile monthly investment for the rest of the American campaign season. That was the big story. We hope to be a worthwhile investment of your time, not just for the remainder of the campaign season, but forever, because we like you. You can find more from us at thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can send us feedback. As I mentioned, we have a feedback episode coming for you on this holiday Monday. The way to give us feedback, it's too late to get in that one. We just recorded it, but you can get in the next one. The way to do it is by emailing us. hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca is that address. Or by calling us, 416-935-5935, and leaving a voicemail. And a reminder, if you leave us a voicemail and you're okay with us using it in a feedback episode, please tell us that, because we won't use your voice without your consent. The Big Story is available in every single podcast player, and it's on your smart speaker. Just ask it to play the Big Story podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.